Welcome to the 66th reading of my memoir, The Innocence of Guilt. The aftermath of Dad's passing. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and be filled with the loss of my dad. I cried then for what might have been. The tiny seed of our love we'd planted, but which hadn't had a chance to grow. Although Brian and I weren't attending church anymore, I thanked God for prompting me to write that letter to my parents 2 months before my father died. I thought about the guilt I would be suffering if I hadn't asked for his forgiveness. My brother confided to me later on that his last memory of his dad had unfortunately been of a quarrel the night before. Dad stormed up the stairs to bed and David went to sleep, disgusted at the futility of their constant disagreements. Most of Dad's moods and tempers were of a pointless nature in his opinion. Fortunately, David hadn't suffered any guilt. Although at peace about my dad, I still obsessed over irrational things. At times, so beset by nagging thoughts, I walked to the doctor's evening surgery, trying to muster enough courage to go inside and ask for help. The door of the surgery seemed to call out to me, "Don't be silly, go in and tell the doctor how you feel." But I never did. Brian and I went home to see Mum as often as we could, but the visits became unpleasant for me. Mum launched an all-out attack on my dad's character and everything he stood for. She went on and on about her terrible marriage and all he had put her through, most of which I was naturally aware of, having grown up with them. I knew they hadn't been blissfully happy together. I didn't need to hear every indiscretion he'd committed and every failing he'd ever been a part of. There were rumours of an affair with a woman at the factory, something Mum had no proof of, only suspicion. She said she was glad Dad was gone. Now she was free, but she didn't seem free, only consumed with bitterness and anger. Brian listened patiently to a portion of 24 years' worth of painful memories each time we visited, and I don't know how he managed to keep his temper with her. In my view, it was an awful way to treat the memory of a husband, somebody you once loved. Sometimes I escaped into the scullery, closed the door and had a good cry because I couldn't stand her vicious words. She claimed he was mentally unstable and attempted suicide at least once. He hadn't always provided for his family. He had a bad temper, so on and so on. My father's troubled life spread out before me like manure on a field, the strong odour invading my wounded senses. From what she said, I knew my father and I were more alike, with more in common than I'd ever imagined. I began to loathe my mother for despising him so in death. I'd forgiven him for everything, asked for his forgiveness. That's how much I wanted to love him. And she trampled all over my newfound love. I knew I could never share with her my compassion for my father's problematic behaviour because she wouldn't want to know. I also knew I couldn't share my problems with her, as she would no doubt cast me in the same negative light. Some evidence surfaced about Dad attending gospel meetings at the factory shortly before he died, and I sensed in my heart that he must have found God. That would account for the change in his behaviour the last time I saw him, and the peaceful atmosphere in the house after he'd gone. As time went by, Mum ended up having to go on medication for high blood pressure. Her hair fell out in huge handfuls whenever she washed it, and she feared going bald. Her doctor said she had buried her feelings and denied the reality of her husband's death. She accepted the diagnosis, but with a certain note of disdain in her voice. Brian and I weren't sure what to think. Her physical problems could have been the stress of all the anger and bitterness she wallowed in. We told her she had an opportunity now to do some of the activities she claimed to be interested in, such as ballroom dancing or art classes. She was still young enough at 54 to dance, and she'd always been talented at drawing, but she wasn't interested. She only wanted to complain to all and sundry about the injustices meted out to her. We didn't know what we could do while in London, busy with our own challenges of everyday life, isolated from her dilemma. We took comfort in the fact that she had David, Dindin, and her little dog at home. One positive happened out of all the negatives. The next-door landlady wanted to sell number 64, and Mum, as a sitting tenant, had first chance to buy it. She purchased the house for the amazingly low sum of £800. Rent paid on it for 6 years helped towards the low price. The new year of 1967 found us searching again for a new flat. A foul odour wafted up from the kitchen drain, and our landlord wouldn't attend to it. Brian was too busy studying to contemplate the business of moving again, but living in that environment ate away at me. I feared, perhaps unduly or perhaps not, that the odour endangered our health. We found another street-level furnished flat in Highgate, 141A Southwood Lane, almost at the bottom of the junction, entering Archway Road, a very busy thoroughfare. If you walked up it a long, long way, you reached Hampstead Heath, London's famous 790 acres of green open space. We instantly became friends with a married couple, Ian and Phyllis, situated in the flat immediately above us with their 2 small children. The remaining building was separated into other flats on different levels, all higgledy-piggledy, so from the outside, with all the different exterior walkways twisting in various directions, you hardly knew where one flat ended and another one began, part of its charm. At work, Matron constantly wore me down with her superior attitude, upset with me when I didn't know how to lay out the examining instruments for visiting doctors. She demeaned me in front of them. "She's not a real nurse, you know," she'd say, in her haughty way of talking. I stood there and took the humiliation. An advertisement in the newspaper offered a state-enrolled nurse, SEN, 2-year course at the Whittington Hospital, farther down Archway Road on Highgate Hill. You would be paid well while you trained, and you could live in or out of the hospital. I ran it by Brian. He said it didn't matter to him. He worked as an assistant lecturer at the university since his grant ran out, so we were managing fine financially. When I handed in my notice, Matron expressed utter shock. "You're leaving, nurse?" she exclaimed. I thought she'd be pleased. I was going to become a real nurse at last, but oh no, I had let her down. She failed to see she brought it upon herself. The first 2 months of training were full of enjoyable challenges. A part of my personality emerged that made me popular amongst the other pupil nurses as I spearheaded the study classes and projects. My organizational abilities, what my brother and some of my early friends had labelled bossiness. I thrived on my classmates' feedback. Later, I enjoyed the ward work, especially when accident victims were admitted and split decisions were made, with no time to get emotional. Procedures followed, snap, snap, snap. I imagined myself working in emergency where everything you did was literally a matter of life or death, drama. Some frustration during the ward work period with an attempt to start a study group in our flat. Most of the other girls lived in residence, so they had support from each other. I wanted support too, and I suspect that's what partly unravelled me, the disembodied isolation I experienced towards the end of my first year. Exam time came around, and as usual, I achieved high marks on my written tests. In the atmosphere of the classroom, I thrived, but on the wards I became disconnected from the meaning of my studies. Then I had to prepare for a practical exam. So simple I ought to have breezed through it with my eyes closed. I failed it miserably. At the end of the exam, the tutor, who hadn't met me before, strode out of the ward in disgust, and I knew it was all over. I went into the lavatory and had a good cry. Brian had told me that if a university student worked for 3 years on a degree and failed part of his final exam, he wasn't allowed to retake the part he failed. He had to wait a year and then retake all the exams from the last 2 years, including ones he'd passed. I wasn't sure if something similar applied to my situation, but I feared it might. Rules, after all, were meant to be obeyed. I decided to hand in my notice. Brian didn't try to talk me out of it, any more than he'd talked me into nursing in the first place. Far too busy studying and lecturing to be concerned with my latest job crisis. At the student office, I gave domestic problems as the reason for why I wanted to abandon a year of studying. No one would question it in my married state. No one would interfere with whatever my problems might be. What hurt me, though, was that the head tutor didn't ask to see me. I'd secretly hoped she would talk me out of it. I happened to be her top pupil, and my ward reports were excellent. Mystified as to my sudden lack of value to her, I didn't have the courage to go and see her, and so faded away, so to speak. None of my classmates knew, and my isolation brought on depression. It didn't help that I was immediately put on night duty to work out my notice of 1 month. Discarded. Looking back on that time, I believe that I discarded myself. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment on this reading, and hopefully you will tune in to the next one. Bye for now.